If someone had told me that at 58, after decades of living a quiet, respectable life, I'd find myself in the middle of a situation that I could never have anticipated or even imagined, I would have laughed at the absurdity of it. But life, as I've come to learn, has a way of surprising us, especially when we least expect it. This story isn't one I've shared before, and perhaps I never will again. It's too complicated, too messy, and far too revealing. Yet as I sit here, a glass of wine in my hand and the evening shadows creeping across my living room, I find myself reflecting on that one weekend that changed everything. It was supposed to be an ordinary visit. My nephew Tom had called earlier that week, asking if he could come to stay for a few days, to escape the bustle of city life. "Bring your friends if you'd like," I had said, not thinking much of it. When they arrived, I greeted them at the door with my usual warmth. Tom was his usual charming self, all bright smiles and effervescent energy. Behind him stood two men I hadn't met before. Brian, tall and brooding, with a quiet intensity about him, and Max, whose boyish grin and easy laughter instantly put me at ease. The house felt livelier than it had in years, their voices filling the space that had long been dominated by silence. I hadn't realized how much I missed having people around. As the weekend unfolded, I found myself drawn into their orbit. It was a strange feeling, being the only woman in a house full of younger men. At times I felt like a hostess, ensuring they were comfortable and well-fed. At other times I felt like one of them, laughing at their jokes and joining in their games. Tom was the one who brought them into my life, but it was Brian and Max who intrigued me in ways I hadn't expected. There was something magnetic about them, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I noticed the glances Brian would steal when he thought I wasn't looking, his eyes lingering a moment too long. I noticed the way Max's hand would graze mine as he passed me a plate at dinner, the touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. And I noticed how my own heart seemed to race whenever I was alone with either of them. I told myself it was nothing, a harmless spark of attraction, nothing more. But then came that evening, the evening when everything changed. It had been a long day of lounging in the garden and playing board games in the living room. As the sun set, casting a warm golden glow over the house, we moved to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Tom, ever the life of the party, decided to run to the store for more wine. "I won't be long," he said, grabbing his keys and heading out the door. For the first time all weekend, it was just the three of us, Brian, Max, and me. The atmosphere in the house shifted the moment Tom left. It wasn't dramatic, not at first, but there was something in the air, a kind of tension that hadn't been there before. We sat in the living room, sipping wine and talking about nothing in particular. The conversation was easy, but beneath it was an undercurrent of something unspoken. "Eleanor," Max said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet, "can I ask you something?" I looked at him, his boyish grin replaced by a more serious expression. "Of course," I said, setting my glass down. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Living here all alone. Doesn't it get lonely?" The question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I've learned to find joy in the little things. My garden, my books, my painting. It's a simple life, but it suits me." Brian, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "You're an amazing woman, Eleanor," he said, his deep voice resonating in the small room. "I don't think I've ever met someone as strong and graceful as you." His words took my breath away. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, and I quickly reached for my glass of wine, taking a long sip to steady myself. "You're too kind," I said, trying to deflect the intensity of his compliment. But Brian wasn't finished. "I mean it," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're incredible." The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken emotion. I could feel Max's gaze on me, and when I glanced at him, I saw the same intensity in his eyes. For the first time in years, I felt alive. It was a dangerous feeling, one that thrilled and terrified me in equal measure. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew that whatever it was, it would change everything. It's strange how life twists and turns in ways we never expect. If you'd told me a decade ago that I'd be spending my evenings alone in a big quiet house, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, I was still married to Richard, a man who filled every room he entered with his larger-than-life presence. We had a good life together, 2 children, a beautiful home, and years of memories that I still cherish. But then Richard passed, and everything changed. It wasn't sudden, but that didn't make it any easier. Watching someone you love fade away is a kind of pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. After he was gone, the house felt impossibly empty, the silence almost suffocating. My children, both grown and with lives of their own, visited when they could, but it wasn't the same. For a long time I drifted. Days bled into weeks, and I found myself going through the motions of life without truly living it. It wasn't until I picked up a paintbrush again, a hobby I'd abandoned years ago, that I began to feel like myself. Painting became my therapy, a way to process my grief and find beauty in the world again. It was during this time that Tom started visiting more often. Tom is my sister's son, but in many ways, I've always thought of him as my own. He spent much of his childhood in my home, tagging along with my children during school breaks and holidays. Even as an adult, he remained close, often calling or stopping by to check on me. "Just making sure you're not turning into a hermit, Aunt Eleanor," he'd say, grinning as he handed me a bottle of wine or a bouquet of flowers. His visits were a balm for my loneliness. Tom had a way of lighting up the room with his infectious energy and easy charm. He was the kind of person who could make you laugh even when you didn't feel like it, and his presence always left me feeling a little less alone. About a week before the weekend that changed everything, Tom called to ask if he could come to stay. "Of course," I said, not hesitating for a moment. "Great," he replied. "And, would it be okay if I brought a couple of friends? They're good guys, I promise. They just need a break from the city as much as I do." I hesitated, but only briefly. It had been a long time since I'd had a full house, and the idea of having company, even if it was Tom's friends, was strangely appealing. "Bring whoever you'd like," I said. When they arrived, I was immediately struck by how different the three of them were. Tom was his usual effervescent self, bounding through the door with an energy that seemed boundless. Behind him was Brian, tall and quiet, with an air of seriousness that was almost intimidating. His dark eyes seemed to take in everything around him, and though he didn't say much at first, there was a depth to him that intrigued me. Then there was Max. If Brian was the storm, Max was the sunshine. He had a boyish grin that made you feel at ease, and his laughter was warm and genuine. While Brian seemed content to sit back and observe, Max jumped right in, helping me carry their bags and joking about how Tom hadn't told them his aunt was this cool. "Well, Tom tends to exaggerate," I said, smiling as I led them to their rooms. The first day of their visit was easy and pleasant. We spent the morning drinking coffee on the porch, the men sharing stories about their lives in the city. Tom, as always, dominated the conversation, but I noticed the way Brian would occasionally interject with sharp, insightful comments that made us all pause and think. Max, on the other hand, kept us laughing with his quick wit and playful banter. By the afternoon, we were in the garden, weeding and trimming hedges. It was a warm, sunny day, and the light-hearted atmosphere made the work feel more like play. "You've really got a little paradise here, Aunt Eleanor," Max said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I don't know how you do it." "It's a labor of love," I replied. "The garden has always been my happy place." Brian, who had been working silently nearby, nodded in agreement. "It shows," he said. "There's something peaceful about this place. I can see why Tom loves it here." His words touched me more than I expected, and for a moment, I found myself looking at him longer than I should have. That evening, we sat around the dining table, sharing a meal I'd spent most of the afternoon preparing. It was a simple meal, roast chicken, potatoes, and a salad from the garden, but the company made it feel special. We talked and laughed, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. Tom, as always, was the life of the party, regaling us with stories of his misadventures in the city. "Tell them about the time you got stuck on the roof," Max said, grinning as he topped off his glass. "Oh, no," Tom groaned, burying his face in his hands. "It's too good a story not to share," Max insisted. I watched them with a mixture of amusement and affection. There was something wonderful about seeing Tom so at ease, surrounded by friends who clearly cared for him deeply. As the night wore on, the conversation turned more personal. "Do you ever get lonely out here, Aunt Eleanor?" Max asked, his voice softer than usual. The question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. Sometimes, I admitted. But I've learned to find joy in the little things. My garden, my painting, they keep me company. Brian, who had been quiet for most of the evening, spoke up. It's admirable, he said, what you've built here. It's rare to meet someone who's truly content with their life. His words struck a chord in me, though I wasn't sure why. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about Brian and Max. There was something about them. Something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. It was dangerous, I knew, to entertain such thoughts. But I couldn't help it. The next day was much the same, filled with laughter and easy camaraderie. We played board games in the living room, the competitive energy between Tom and Max keeping us all entertained. But there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when the atmosphere between us shifted. I noticed the way Brian's eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. I noticed the way Max's laughter softened when our gazes met. And I noticed the way my own heart raced whenever I was near them. By the time Tom announced he was going to the store to grab more wine that evening, I was both relieved and anxious. Relieved because I needed a moment to collect myself, and anxious because I didn't trust myself to navigate the growing tension between me and his friends. But when Tom left, the house suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. For the first time all weekend, it was just the three of us. And that was when everything changed. When Tom left for the store that evening, the house fell into a strange, expectant silence. The three of us, Brian, Max, and I, sat in the living room sipping the last of the wine from dinner. The conversation, which had flowed so easily earlier in the day, now felt stilted, each of us offering comments that seemed to fall flat. I could feel the weight of their gazes, though I pretended not to notice. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, an energy that made my pulse quicken. I told myself it was nothing, just the lingering effects of the wine and the warmth of the evening. But then Max leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and spoke. You know, he said, his voice unusually soft, this house feels like it belongs in a storybook. It's so alive. I smiled, grateful for the distraction. Thank you, Max. It's been my little sanctuary for years. Brian, who had been quiet until now, nodded in agreement. There's something special about it, he said, his deep voice resonating in the stillness. But I think it's you who makes it that way, Eleanor. His words caught me off guard, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. That's very kind of you, Brian, I said, my voice faltering slightly. It's true, he insisted, his dark eyes locking onto mine. You have this presence, this grace, it's inspiring. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My heart was pounding, and I could feel Max's gaze on me as well. You do, Max said, his tone more playful but no less sincere. You're like, I don't know, the kind of woman people write songs about. Now you're both just flattering me, I said, trying to laugh off the intensity of the moment. But neither of them laughed. The silence stretched on, and I felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward them. It was a dangerous feeling, one that both thrilled and terrified me. I glanced at the clock, willing Tom to return, but the minutes seemed to drag on endlessly. Max was the first to break the silence. Eleanor, he said, his voice low, can I ask you something? Of course, I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. Do you ever feel like you're missing something? The question was so unexpected, so personal, that I didn't know how to answer. I hesitated, searching for the right words, but Max continued before I could speak. I mean, you've built this amazing life for yourself, he said, gesturing around the room. But do you ever wish there was more? I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the question itself that unsettled me, it was the way he was looking at me, as though he already knew the answer. Sometimes, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Brian leaned forward then, his dark eyes searching mine. What do you wish for, Eleanor? He asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and intimate. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to put into words the ache I felt deep inside, the longing for connection, for passion, for something that made me feel alive again. Without thinking, I stood and moved to the window, my back to them. I don't know, I said, staring out at the darkened garden. I suppose I wish I could feel young again. Just for a moment. There was a pause, and then I heard Max's voice behind me. You don't need to feel young to be alive, Eleanor. I turned to look at him, and the intensity in his gaze took my breath away. He had stood as well, and now he was only a few steps away from me. You're incredible, just as you are, he said, his voice steady and sincere. Before I could respond, Brian stood too, his presence suddenly overwhelming. He's right, Brian said, his deep voice soft but insistent. You don't see it, but we do. You're extraordinary. I felt frozen in place, my mind racing. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening, and yet the look in their eyes, the way they moved closer, made it impossible to deny. You're both being ridiculous, I said, trying to laugh, but my voice cracked. We're not, Max said, stepping closer until he was only a foot away. We mean every word. I turned to Brian, hoping for some reprieve, but he was looking at me with the same intensity. You deserve to feel wanted, Eleanor, he said. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was them. But suddenly the distance between us was gone. Max was the first to touch me, his hand brushing against mine before trailing up to cup my face. His touch was gentle, almost hesitant, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. And then Brian was there too, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, his presence grounding me even as my heart raced. This is crazy, I whispered, my voice trembling. Maybe, Max said, his lips curling into a soft smile. But doesn't it feel right? I couldn't answer because the truth was, it did. The moments that followed felt like a dream, disjointed, surreal, and yet impossibly vivid. Max's lips found mine first, soft and tentative, and then more insistent as I leaned into him. His kiss was warm and intoxicating, and for a moment I forgot everything else. And then Brian's hand was on my waist, pulling me toward him, and his lips replaced Max's. Where Max was gentle, Brian was commanding, his kiss filled with a hunger that left me breathless. Time seemed to blur as the three of us moved together, our touches growing bolder, our breaths mingling in the charged air. I felt like I was on fire, every nerve ending alight with sensation. For the first time in years, I felt alive. When it was over, we lay together on the living room floor, the room bathed in the soft glow of the fireplace. None of us spoke, the silence broken only by the sound of our breathing. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened. A part of me felt exhilarated, but another part felt a deep, gnawing guilt. This can't happen again, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither of them responded, but I could feel the weight of their gazes. When Tom returned a short while later, we were back to sitting on the couch, glasses of wine in hand. The atmosphere was light, almost too light, as though we were all trying to overcompensate for what had just transpired. Tom didn't seem to notice anything amiss, but I couldn't help feeling like the walls were closing in around me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the evening in my mind. The way Max had touched me, the way Brian had looked at me, it was all too much. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of madness that would never happen again. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, the weight of what had happened settled over me like a thick, suffocating fog. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, as the events of the previous evening replayed in my mind. No matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. I told myself it was a lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness brought on by loneliness and too much wine. But the memory of their touches, their voices, their gazes, it was all still so vivid, so electric, that it made my chest tighten and my heart race. I had to face them. When I finally mustered the courage to leave my room, the house was unusually quiet. Tom had already left for a morning run, his cheerful energy absent from the space. It was just the three of us again. I found Max and Brian in the kitchen, sipping coffee and speaking in hushed tones. When I entered, they fell silent, their eyes flickering to me with expressions I couldn't quite read. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady but brittle. "Morning," Max replied, his usual grin replaced by something softer, more tentative. Brian simply nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he looked away. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension. I busied myself with pouring a cup of tea, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to keep my composure. "We should talk," Brian said suddenly, his deep voice breaking the silence. I froze, my back to them, before finally turning around. "About last night," I said, finishing the thought for him. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Max shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee mug. It was a mistake, I said firmly, though my voice wavered. We got caught up in the moment, and it shouldn't have happened. Neither of them responded right away, and the silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. I don't think it was a mistake, Max said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. I stared at him, my heart pounding. Max. It wasn't planned, he continued, his blue eyes earnest as they met mine. But it wasn't meaningless either. At least not to me. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned to Brian, hoping for some reprieve. But he nodded, his dark gaze steady. He's right, Brian said. It wasn't meaningless. The words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Part of me wanted to believe them, to give in to the warmth and connection I had felt the night before. But the other part of me, the part rooted in logic and reason, knew that this couldn't continue. It doesn't matter, I said finally, my voice trembling. It can't happen again. The mention of Tom seemed to break whatever spell had held us, and a shadow of guilt flickered across Max's face. You're right, Brian said, his tone firm but tinged with regret. It can't happen again. Max opened his mouth as if to argue, but Brian gave him a sharp look, silencing him. I nodded, relief and sorrow washing over me in equal measure. Thank you, I said quietly. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of awkward silences and forced small talk. When Tom returned from his run, he was oblivious to the tension, his cheerful chatter filling the space as he recounted his route through the countryside. But I couldn't relax. Every glance from Max or Brian felt loaded with meaning, and I found myself retreating more and more into myself as the day wore on. That evening, as we sat around the dining table, I noticed the subtle shifts in our dynamic. Brian, who had been so stoic and composed before, seemed more guarded, his words carefully measured. Max, on the other hand, was quieter than usual, his easygoing demeanor replaced by something more subdued. Tom didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't help feeling like I was balancing on a knife's edge, one wrong word away from everything unraveling. After dinner, Tom suggested we watch a movie, his enthusiasm infectious despite my unease. I agreed, hoping it would help lighten the mood. We settled into the living room, Tom sprawled across the couch while I sat in an armchair, a safe distance from Max and Brian. The movie played on, but I couldn't focus. My mind was too busy replaying every glance, every touch, every whispered word from the night before. When the credits rolled, Tom yawned and stretched, declaring he was off to bed. Long run this morning, he said with a grin. I'm beat. Good night, Tom, I said, forcing a smile. He disappeared down the hall, leaving the three of us alone again. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fireplace, its warm light casting flickering shadows across the room. I should go to bed too, I said finally, rising from my chair. Max stood as well, his expression conflicted. Eleanor, I shook my head, cutting him off. Good night, Max, Brian. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked to my room, closing the door behind me. The next morning, the tension had become unbearable. I found myself avoiding both Max and Brian, slipping out to the garden whenever I heard their voices, or retreating to my studio under the guise of working on a painting. But I couldn't avoid them forever. That afternoon, as I was pruning the roses, Brian approached me. Eleanor, he said, his voice soft but insistent. I straightened, my heart pounding as I turned to face him. Brian, I said, my voice carefully neutral. I just wanted to say. He hesitated, his dark eyes searching mine. I'm sorry if we made you uncomfortable. I swallowed hard, the sincerity in his voice cutting through me. It's not about being uncomfortable, I said. It's about doing what's right. He nodded, his expression solemn. I understand, and for what it's worth, I respect you, Eleanor, more than you know. His words brought a lump to my throat, but I managed a small smile. Thank you, Brian. That evening, Max approached me as well. I feel like I need to say something, he began, his voice hesitant. Last night, it wasn't just a moment for me. It meant something. I closed my eyes, his words both thrilling and devastating. Max, You don't have to say anything, he interrupted, his tone gentle. I just wanted you to know. By the time Tom announced they would be leaving the next morning, I felt both relieved and heartbroken. The weekend had been a whirlwind of emotions, and I wasn't sure how to move forward. As they packed their bags, I busied myself in the kitchen, avoiding the inevitable goodbyes. But when they were ready to leave, Brian and Max each took a moment to speak with me privately. Brian was the first, his dark eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady but soft. "You're an incredible woman." Max followed, his usual grin replaced by something more serious. "I hope you know how special you are," he said. "Thank you for everything." When the door closed behind them, the house fell into silence once more. I stood in the empty living room, staring at the space where they had been, and felt a strange mixture of relief, sadness, and longing. I had survived the weekend, but I knew that a part of me had been irrevocably changed. When the door closed behind them, and their car disappeared down the winding country road, I was left with the weight of silence. For years I'd grown accustomed to the quiet, even found solace in it. But that day, the silence felt different, hollow, and suffocating, as though it was pressing down on me, demanding answers to questions I wasn't ready to face. I tried to busy myself with chores. I cleaned the kitchen, straightened the living room, and tended to the garden, but no amount of sweeping or pruning could erase the memories of the weekend. It wasn't just the physicality of what had happened that lingered. It was the emotions. The longing in Brian's eyes, the tenderness in Max's voice, the way they both made me feel like a woman again, not just a widow or an aging aunt. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. That evening, as the sun set over the hills, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch. The garden, usually a source of comfort, felt distant and unfamiliar. I stared out at the flowers, their vibrant colors muted in the dimming light, and tried to make sense of what I was feeling. Was it guilt, regret, or was it something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name? I thought about Brian, his steady gaze and quiet intensity. He had a way of seeing through me, of peeling back the layers I had so carefully constructed around myself. And then there was Max, with his boyish charm and disarming warmth. He had a way of making me feel alive, as though the years hadn't dulled my spirit as much as I feared. But it wasn't just about them, it was about me. For the first time in years, I had felt something more than the monotony of my day-to-day life. I had felt wanted, seen, and valued, not for what I had lost or what I could provide, but for who I was. And that realization was as liberating as it was terrifying. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. I tried to lose myself in my painting, but every canvas I touched seemed to reflect the chaos inside me. Swirling colors and jagged lines, no clear focus or direction. My friends noticed the change in my work, but I couldn't bring myself to explain it. "Your paintings are so raw," one of them said during a visit to my studio. "It's like you're working through something." "I suppose I am," I replied, offering a vague smile. A week after they left, I received a message from Max. "Eleanor, I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. I know the weekend was a lot, but I hope you're okay. Thank you again for letting us stay. It meant more to me than I can say." Reading his words, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite define. Gratitude? Sadness? Longing? I didn't reply right away. I wasn't sure what to say, how to respond to someone who had stirred feelings in me that I thought were long dormant. But later that night, after staring at my phone for what felt like hours, I typed out a response. "Max, thank you for your message. I'm doing well, all things considered. I hope you and Brian are both settling back into city life. Take care of yourself." It was short, polite, and impersonal. The safest response I could manage. The next day, I received a package in the mail. When I opened it, I found a book, an old leather-bound volume of poetry. Inside the front cover was a note written in Brian's careful handwriting. "Eleanor, I saw this and thought of you. I hope you find as much beauty in these words as I do. Thank you for everything." His gesture was thoughtful, almost painfully so. I ran my fingers over the embossed title, feeling a lump rise in my throat. They hadn't forgotten me, even as I tried to forget them. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, life began to return to its familiar rhythm. The garden bloomed with the arrival of spring, and my painting took on a brighter, more hopeful tone. I began to see friends more often, to host small gatherings that brought life and laughter back into my home. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the memories of that weekend lingered in the quiet moments. Late at night when the house was still, or in the early mornings when the sun's first light crept across the floor. I thought about reaching out to them more times than I could count, but I always stopped myself. I told myself it was better this way, that the distance would help us all move on. It wasn't until summer that I saw Tom again. He arrived unannounced one sunny afternoon, his arms full of groceries, and his usual grin firmly in place. "Aunt Eleanor," he called, his voice echoing through the house. I greeted him with a hug, grateful for the distraction. We spent the afternoon cooking together, his cheerful chatter filling the space as we prepared a meal from the vegetables in the garden. But as we sat down to eat, he grew quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. "Is everything okay?" I asked, setting my fork down. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. I've been meaning to thank you." "For what?" "For being there for Brian and Max," he said. "They've both said how much that weekend meant to them. I think it really helped them in ways they didn't expect." His words caught me off guard, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "I'm glad to hear that," I said carefully. "They're good guys," Tom continued. "And they both think the world of you." I smiled, but inside, my emotions were churning. After Tom left, I found myself thinking about what he had said. Was it possible that I had helped them, even as I wrestled with my own guilt and confusion? I began to see the weekend in a different light. Not as a mistake, but as a moment of connection in an otherwise solitary existence. It hadn't been perfect, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been real. And that, I realized, was something to hold on to. Months later, as I sat in my garden watching the autumn leaves fall, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Life is messy, unpredictable, and often full of contradictions. But it's also beautiful, filled with moments of connection that remind us of what it means to be human. I don't know if I'll ever see Max or Brian again. Maybe it's better if I don't. But I'll always carry the memory of that weekend with me, not as a source of regret, but as a reminder that even in the quietest corners of life, there's still room for unexpected joy. The moment I realized things had gone too far was when I felt Landon's hand linger just a second too long against mine. We were standing in the kitchen, surrounded by bags of flour, spilled sugar, and a few broken eggs. Christmas music played faintly in the background, and the warm, spicy smell of cinnamon filled the air. From the outside, it must have looked like any other family holiday moment. But it wasn't. Robert had left that morning on yet another business trip. He wouldn't be back until Christmas Eve, which left Landon and me alone in the house. I hadn't planned for us to spend the evening baking cookies together. It just happened. "I don't think this is how it's supposed to look," Landon said, holding up a lumpy mound of dough. His dark hair was a mess, and there was a streak of flour across his cheek. I couldn't help but laugh. "You were supposed to follow the recipe, not wing it." He grinned, leaning against the counter. "I'm more of a creative type. Recipes are too restrictive." "That's one way to put it," I said, rolling out another batch of dough. Landon was always like that, charming, easygoing, with a knack for making every moment feel like an adventure. It was one of the reasons he'd done so well at work. He had a natural talent for design, and his ideas were often the ones that made our game projects stand out. But outside of work, things felt complicated. I didn't know exactly when I'd started noticing him in a way I shouldn't. Maybe it was the way he laughed at my jokes, even when they weren't funny. Or the way he stayed late at the office to help me with projects, even when he didn't have to. Or the way he looked at me sometimes, like I was the only person in the room. At first, I'd brushed it off as harmless admiration. After all, I was his stepmother, married to his father. There was nothing more to it. But standing there in the kitchen, watching him roll up his sleeves and smirk at me like we were sharing some private joke, I felt my resolve slipping. "Here, let me show you how it's done," I said, stepping closer. Landon handed me the rolling pin, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but it sent a spark of heat through me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the dough in front of me. "You have to press evenly, like this," I said, demonstrating. He moved closer, leaning over my shoulder to watch. His chest brushed against my back, and I felt my breath catch. Like this? He asked, his voice low and warm. I swallowed hard. Yeah, just like that. The air between us felt thick, charged with something unspoken. I could feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of his cologne, mixed with the cinnamon in the air. I told myself it was nothing. Just a moment. Just a little too close. But then he reached out, his hand resting lightly on mine as I rolled the dough. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I should step away, make some excuse, do anything to break the tension. But I didn't. Vanessa, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, and the space between us disappeared. His eyes met mine, dark and searching, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. We shouldn't, I said, my voice trembling. I know, he said, his hand still on mine. But it doesn't feel wrong. His words hung in the air, and I knew I should shut it down, put an end to whatever was happening before it went any further. But the truth was, I didn't want to. It wasn't just about the way he looked at me or the way he touched me. It was about how he made me feel, alive, seen, wanted. When he leaned in, I didn't stop him. His lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative, and my resolve crumbled. The kiss deepened, slow and searching, and I felt myself melting into him. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and for a moment, all the guilt and fear faded away. It wasn't until the timer on the oven beeped that we broke apart, breathless and wide-eyed. We can't do this, I said, stepping back. I know, he said, his voice steady, but that doesn't change how I feel. My heart ached at his words. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, but I couldn't. Instead, I turned away, pretending to busy myself with the cookies. Your dad will be home soon, I said, trying to sound casual. Landon didn't press the issue. He just nodded and helped me finish baking, the tension between us simmering just beneath the surface. Later that night, after Landon had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the glowing lights of the Christmas tree. What had I done? I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I knew better. The kiss had been a spark, and now there was no putting out the fire. The days after that kiss were a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't seem to shake. Guilt, excitement, fear, they all churned inside me, twisting into a knot that tightened every time I saw Landon. We didn't talk about what happened in the kitchen, but the air between us was charged with unspoken tension. I threw myself into work, hoping the deadlines and meetings would distract me. But working with Landon every day only made things harder. It had all started weeks before the night in the kitchen, during one of those endless late nights at the office. The holiday project was in full swing, and Landon had been tasked with designing a new character for our Christmas-themed game. His sketches were brilliant, full of life and personality, and I found myself drawn to the way he poured himself into his work. Vanessa, what do you think of this one? He asked, holding up a concept sketch. I leaned over his desk, studying the drawing. The character was whimsical, full of quirky details that made it feel real. It's perfect, I said, meaning it. He grinned, the kind of boyish smile that made my chest tighten. Thanks, I wasn't sure about the color palette, but if you like it, I'll run with it. It's great, I said, straightening up. You have a real talent for this, you know. His smile faltered for a moment, and he looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like he was searching for something. It means a lot, hearing that from you. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and walked back to my desk. But the way he looked at me stayed with me long after the conversation ended. A week later, the team was sent to a gaming conference in Chicago. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trip. Attend panels, showcase our game, and network with industry professionals. But, as always, things didn't go as planned. The first night, after a long day at the convention, the team decided to go out for drinks. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to stay in my hotel room and avoid the chaos, but Alyssa convinced me. Come on, Vanessa, she said, linking her arm through mine. You never let loose. One drink won't kill you. We ended up at a crowded bar near the convention center. The music was loud, the lights dim, and the energy in the room was electric. Landon sat across from me at the table, nursing a beer and laughing at something Alyssa said. I tried to focus on the conversation, but my eyes kept drifting to him. The way his smile lit up his face, the way he ran his fingers through his hair when he laughed, it was maddening. At some point, Alyssa and the others decided to hit the dance floor, leaving me and Landon alone at the table. "You don't dance?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not my thing," I said, sipping my wine. "Me neither," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Too many people, too much noise." I laughed. "So why are you here?" He shrugged, his gaze steady on mine. "Because you are." My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't think of anything to say. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Before I could respond, he stood and held out his hand. "Come on, let's get out of here." We ended up at a quiet cafe a few blocks away, the kind of place that stayed open late and served coffee in mismatched mugs. "I needed a break from all that noise," he said as we sat down in a booth near the back. "Me too," I said, grateful for the change of pace. We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. He told me about his college days, how he got into game design, and his dreams of creating his own studio someday. I told him about my early career, how I worked my way up to creative director, and how much I loved what I did, even when it was stressful. "You're amazing, you know that?" he said, his voice soft. I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said, leaning forward. "You're more than that. You're smart, talented, and, God, Vanessa, you're beautiful." His words caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks flush. "Landon, I'm serious," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "You have no idea how much I admire you." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to tell him he was just being kind. But another part of me, the part I tried to ignore, wanted to believe him. Later that night, as we walked back to the hotel, the tension between us was palpable. The streets were quiet, the cold air biting against my skin. When we reached the hotel, I hesitated in the lobby, not ready to say goodnight. "Vanessa," he said, stepping closer. "I know this is complicated, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you." His words hit me like a freight train. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was full of emotion, raw and desperate, like he'd been holding back for too long. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my hands tangling in his hair as weeks of tension and longing came rushing to the surface. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. "This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "But it already has." We didn't talk about it the next day, but everything had changed. The line between us had been crossed, and there was no going back. Back at the office, we tried to act like nothing had happened. But the stolen glances, the accidental touches, the unspoken tension, it was all there, simmering beneath the surface. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it all came to a head. By the time Christmas week rolled around, Landon and I had slipped into something I could no longer control. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something we'd ever sat down and discussed. But after that night in the kitchen and everything that had happened before it, a door had opened between us, one that neither of us wanted to close. It started with stolen moments at work. At first, they were innocent enough. He'd linger at my desk a little longer than necessary, or I'd find excuses to walk past his station. We'd exchange glances during meetings, quick and loaded with meaning. But those moments quickly escalated. One late afternoon, when most of the office had cleared out for the day, I found myself in the small storage room down the hall. I'd gone there to grab supplies for a meeting, but when I turned around, Landon was standing in the doorway. "Hey," he said, his voice low. I froze, the tension between us immediate and electrifying. "Landon, you can't." "I know," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. I needed to see you." His words sent a shiver down my spine. The room was small, barely big enough for the two of us, and the air felt heavy with everything we weren't saying. "You shouldn't be here," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Do you want me to go?" he asked, his eyes locked on mine. I couldn't answer. The rational part of me was screaming at him to leave, to put some distance between us, before we did something we couldn't take back. But the part of me that had been aching for him, the part that couldn't stop thinking about the way his lips felt on mine, wanted him to stay. When he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine, I didn't pull away. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered, his voice raw. Before I could respond, his lips were on mine. The kiss was desperate, hungry, and I found myself giving in, my hands tangling in his hair as weeks of tension erupted into something neither of us could control. The storage room became our secret. Over the next few weeks, we found excuses to slip away. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. The risk of being caught only heightened the thrill, and I found myself craving those moments with him more than I wanted to admit. At home, things were more complicated. Robert was still busy with work, his attention fixed on conference calls and client meetings. He barely noticed when I stayed late at the office, brushing off my excuses with a distracted nod. But Landon was always there, a constant presence that I couldn't ignore. One night, when Robert was working late in his home office, I found Landon in the living room. He was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone, and when he looked up at me, something in his gaze made my breath catch. "You okay?" he asked, sitting up. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Yeah. Just tired." "Come here," he said, patting the space next to him. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down. The couch felt too small, the space between us too close. "Long day?" he asked, his voice soft. "You could say that," I replied, trying to keep my tone casual. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the TV, and the silence between us felt heavy, charged. "Vanessa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine. The kiss was slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the frantic desperation we'd shared in the storage room. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, the rest of the world fading away. It wasn't long before our affair spilled out of the office and into other parts of our lives. We started meeting in secret. His car, a quiet corner of the park, even a hotel room once when Robert was out of town. Every moment with him felt stolen, like we were living on borrowed time. The first time we went to the hotel, I nearly backed out. The guilt of what we were doing weighed heavily on me, but the moment I saw him waiting for me in the lobby, all my doubts melted away. The room was small but cozy, and the moment the door closed behind us, he pulled me into his arms. "I've been thinking about this all day," he said, his voice rough with need. "Me too," I admitted, my cheeks flushing. The hours we spent in that room were a blur of tangled sheets, whispered confessions, and stolen kisses. For the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was finally being seen, finally being wanted. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide what was happening. Alyssa, ever perceptive, started to notice the change in me. "You seem different lately," she said one afternoon as we grabbed coffee during a meeting break. "Different how?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "I don't know. Happier, maybe?" "Lighter," she said, studying me with a curious smile. "Whatever it is, keep doing it." Her words sent a pang of guilt through me. If only she knew. At the same time, Robert began to ask more questions. "You've been working late a lot lately," he said one evening over dinner. "Things have been busy," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Too busy to spend time with your family?" he asked, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. I forced a smile. "It's just temporary. Once the holiday project is finished, things will slow down." He didn't press the issue, but I could feel the tension growing between us. Despite the risks, I couldn't bring myself to end things with Landon. Every time I thought about walking away, the thought of losing him felt unbearable. I knew what we were doing was wrong. I knew the fallout would be catastrophic if anyone found out. But when I was with him, none of that seemed to matter. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living. And I wasn't ready to let that go. The weeks that followed were a balancing act that tested every ounce of my composure. On the surface, I maintained the facade of a dutiful wife, a focused creative director, and a stepmother who had everything under control. But underneath, my life was a chaotic mess. Landon and I were playing a dangerous game, and it was only a matter of time before the cracks began to show. It started with the close calls. One night, Robert came home earlier than expected. I just stepped out of Landon's room, my hair still tousled and my heart racing, when I heard the front door slam shut. "Vanessa," Robert called, his voice carrying through the hallway. I froze, my mind scrambling for an excuse. "In here," I called back, darting into the kitchen and grabbing a dish towel as if I'd been cleaning. Robert walked in, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, and gave me a suspicious look. "What are you doing?" "Just tidying up," I said, forcing a smile. "You're home early." "The meeting wrapped up ahead of schedule," he said, setting his briefcase on the counter. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, and I felt like I was standing under a spotlight. "You okay?" he asked, his tone curious but guarded. "Of course," I said, turning back to the counter to hide the flush creeping up my neck. "Why wouldn't I be?" He didn't answer, but I could feel his gaze on me. The office wasn't any easier. Jessica, always sharp and observant, had started to notice the subtle shifts in my behavior. "You've been awfully close to Landon lately," she remarked one afternoon as we prepared for a meeting. I kept my tone light, even as my stomach twisted into knots. "He's a valuable member of the team. We work well together." "Uh-huh," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Just be careful, Vanessa. People talk." The implication in her words sent a chill down my spine. I laughed it off, but I knew Jessica wasn't the type to let things slide. Despite the growing tension, Landon and I couldn't stay away from each other. If anything, the risks only made our moments together more intense. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone in the conference room after a meeting. The blinds were drawn, and the soft hum of the projector filled the space as I packed up my notes. Landon lingered by the door, his eyes scanning the empty hallway before he turned to me. "Close call with Jessica earlier," he said, a mischievous grin playing on his lips. "She's just nosy," I replied, though my voice betrayed my nerves. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he helped me gather the papers. "You're tense," he said softly. "Can you blame me?" I asked, glancing up at him. "No," he said, his gaze locking with mine. "But I don't regret any of it." The room suddenly felt too small, the air between us charged. Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips finding mine in a kiss that stole my breath. It was reckless, dangerous, but I couldn't bring myself to care. At home, things were unraveling faster than I could keep up. Robert had always been preoccupied with work, but now he seemed hyper-aware of my every move. "You've been different lately," he said one evening as we sat down to dinner. "Different how?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "I don't know," he said, studying me carefully. "Distracted, distant." I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "Work's been stressful, that's all." He didn't look convinced, but he let it drop. Later that night, I found Landon in the kitchen, his expression tense as he leaned against the counter. "He knows something's up," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Landon's jaw tightened. "Does he know about us?" "No," I said quickly, "but he's suspicious." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Maybe we should back off for a while." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to risk losing you," he said, his voice softening. "But I don't want to hurt you either." The thought of pulling away from him felt unbearable. I knew he was right, but the idea of ending things made my chest ache. "I can't," I said finally, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. "Neither can I." The turning point came a week later. Robert had been growing more suspicious, his questions becoming more pointed. One evening, he confronted me in the living room, his voice sharp and demanding. "Are you having an affair?" he asked bluntly. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "What? No," I said, my voice shaking. "Why would you even think that? You've been distant, distracted. You're always working late, always finding excuses to stay out of the house," he said, his tone laced with anger. "Something's going on, Vanessa." I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. "You're imagining things. Work's been busy, that's all." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue further. The tension reached its breaking point the next night. Robert was working late in his home office, and I found myself drawn to Landon's room. I knew it was reckless, but the need to see him, to be near him, was overwhelming. When I stepped inside, he looked up from his sketchpad, his expression softening when he saw me. "Vanessa," he said, setting the pad aside. I closed the door behind me, my heart pounding. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice trembling. "What do you mean?" he asked, standing and crossing the room to me. "This," I said, gesturing between us. "It's too much. The lies, the risks. I can't keep pretending everything's fine." His eyes searched mine, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue, but instead, he reached out, pulling me into his arms. We'll figure it out, he said softly. I promise. The constant fear of being caught was suffocating, but my feelings for Landon kept pulling me back to him. I knew we were on borrowed time, that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. But I wasn't ready to let him go. Not yet. When it finally happened, it didn't come in the way I expected. I had always imagined the truth would come crashing down on me in one catastrophic moment. Robert bursting into a room at the wrong time, or Jessica piecing together the clues and spilling our secret in the office break room. But instead, it came as a slow unraveling, a series of cracks in the foundation of my carefully constructed life, until there was nothing left to hold it together. Robert's suspicions were growing by the day. He'd always been good at reading people, even if his job often kept him too busy to notice the little things. But now, every glance, every question, every comment seemed sharper, more probing, as if he were trying to catch me slipping. "Who were you texting?" he asked one evening as I stood in the kitchen, my phone still in my hand. "No one," I said quickly, slipping the phone into my pocket. He raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "You've been glued to that thing lately." "It's just work," I said, forcing a casual tone. "The holiday project has everyone on edge." But his gaze lingered a moment too long before he nodded and walked away. That was the thing about Robert, he didn't explode. He didn't demand answers or throw accusations. He watched, he waited, and that made him even more dangerous. At the same time, things with Landon were becoming harder to contain. The more time we spent together, the harder it was to pretend nothing was happening. One evening, while Robert was out at a work dinner, Landon and I sat together in the living room. The glow of the Christmas tree lights cast a soft golden hue over the room, and the faint hum of holiday music played in the background. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and vulnerability. "Why not?" "Because it's wrong," I said, my chest tightening. "Because we're going to get caught." "I don't care," he said, leaning closer. "I love you, Vanessa." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "I know how complicated this is. I know what's at stake. But I can't pretend I don't feel this way about you." Tears welled up in my eyes. "Landon, this isn't fair to you, or to anyone." "It's not about fair," he said, his voice breaking. "It's about what's real." That night, I lay awake in bed, Landon's words echoing in my mind. I loved him. There was no denying that anymore. But the guilt was suffocating, and the fear of what would happen if Robert found out was enough to make me feel like I was drowning. I didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, it happened. Robert came home earlier than usual, his face set in a grim expression. I was sitting at the dining table, going over notes for the next day's meeting, when he walked in and set his briefcase down with a thud. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. My stomach dropped. "What's going on?" He sat down across from me, his hands clasped tightly together. "I've been patient, Vanessa. I've tried to give you the benefit of the doubt, but I can't ignore this anymore." "Ignore what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The late nights, the excuses, the way you've been acting," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not stupid." I swallowed hard, my mind racing for a way out. "Robert, you're imagining things. I've been busy with work, that's all." "Don't lie to me," he said sharply, his voice rising. "I've seen the way you look at him, the way he looks at you." My heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" "Landon," he said, his voice dripping with disgust. "Do you think I haven't noticed? The two of you whispering at dinner, the way you're always finding excuses to be alone together?" I opened my mouth to deny it, but the look on his face told me it was useless. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "It's not what you think," I began, but he cut me off. "How long?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. The truth spilled out before I could stop it. "A few months," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Robert stared at me, his face a mix of shock and fury. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and the silence was deafening. "You disgust me," he said finally, his voice cold and flat. Tears streamed down my face, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. "You've destroyed this family," he said, standing up and grabbing his briefcase. "I hope it was worth it." With that, he walked out the door, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. I found Landon in his room later that night, his face pale and drawn. "He knows," I said, my voice shaking. He nodded, his jaw tight. "I figured." "What are we going to do?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. He reached out, pulling me into his arms. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "We always do." But the uncertainty in his voice told me he didn't believe it any more than I did. The fallout was swift and brutal. Robert moved out the next day, leaving behind only a terse note and a promise to contact his lawyer. At work, the tension between me and Landon was impossible to ignore. Jessica's knowing glances became sharper, her comments more pointed. "You might want to be careful," she said one afternoon as we crossed paths in the hallway. "People are starting to talk." The weight of her words pressed down on me like a stone. That night, Landon and I sat together in the living room, the glow of the Christmas tree casting long shadows across the walls. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice breaking. He nodded, his expression pained. "I know. I love you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe loving each other isn't enough." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but deep down, I knew he was right. The weeks after Robert left were a blur. At first, I thought I'd feel relief. The secret was out, the lies were over, and the constant tension of hiding what Landon and I had been doing was gone. But the reality was far worse than I'd imagined. Robert hadn't just walked out on me. He'd walked out on our life. He left the house cold and empty, and the quiet felt deafening. The weight of what I'd done pressed on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every room in the house felt like a monument to the family I'd destroyed, and every glance from Landon reminded me of the impossible situation we'd created for ourselves. The fallout at work was just as bad. Jessica, always perceptive, had clearly pieced things together. She didn't say anything directly, at least not at first, but her demeanor shifted. The sharp edge in her comments turned into barely veiled accusations, and I could feel the whispers building around me. "Everything okay, Vanessa?" she asked one morning, her tone saccharine sweet. "Fine," I said, forcing a smile. She tilted her head, her gaze sharp. "Just making sure. You've seemed a little distracted lately." I wanted to snap at her, to tell her to mind her own business, but I knew that would only make things worse. The real blow came a few days later, during a meeting with the senior leadership team. Landon and I had been avoiding each other at work as much as possible, but the tension was still palpable. "I've heard some concerns about your team," one of the executives said, his eyes flicking between me and Landon. "Concerns?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Just whispers," he said vaguely. "But it might be worth addressing before things get out of hand." The message was clear. People were talking, and it was only a matter of time before the rumors reached someone with the power to take action. At home, things were no better. Landon and I tried to carry on as if everything was normal, but the weight of what had happened hung over us like a storm cloud. One night, as we sat together in the living room, the silence between us felt unbearable. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," I said finally, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his expression pained. "Do what?" "This," I said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "Pretending like everything's fine when it's not. Living with this constant pressure." Landon nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "I know. I feel it too." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The glow of the Christmas tree cast long shadows across the room, and the faint hum of holiday music played softly in the background. "I love you," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I love you too," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But maybe that's not enough." His eyes searched mine, and I could see the pain in them, the conflict. "What are you saying?" "I don't know," I said honestly. I don't know how to fix this." The breaking point came a few days later when Alyssa, my closest friend at work, confronted me. "I need to ask you something," she said, pulling me aside after a meeting. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. She hesitated, her expression conflicted. "Are you and Landon involved?" The question hit me like a freight train. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the look on her face told me it was useless. "Alyssa, She held up a hand, stopping me. "I don't need the details," she said quietly. "I just need to know if it's true." I nodded, my throat tightening. She let out a long sigh, shaking her head. Vanessa, this is bad. You know that, right? I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm not gonna say anything, she said, but people are already talking. If this gets out, she trailed off, her expression grim. I know, I repeated, tears welling in my eyes. That night, Landon and I sat together in his room, the weight of everything pressing down on us. We need to talk, I said, my voice trembling. He looked up at me, his expression guarded. About what? About us, I said. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. What about us? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. This isn't sustainable, Landon. We're hurting everyone around us, and we're hurting ourselves. I know, he said, his voice barely audible. I love you, I said, tears streaming down my face. But maybe loving each other isn't enough. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he reached out, taking my hand in his. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice breaking. You're not, I said, my voice trembling. But we need to stop, for both our sakes. The next morning, Landon packed his things and left. He didn't say where he was going, and I didn't ask. Watching him walk out the door was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but I knew it was the right thing. For weeks after he left, I felt like a ghost, drifting through my life without purpose. The house felt emptier than ever, and the silence was deafening. I tried to throw myself into work, but the whispers and rumors made it impossible to focus. Eventually, I handed in my resignation and walked away from the career I'd spent years building. Months later, I ran into Landon at a coffee shop downtown. He looked different. Older, more serious, but the moment our eyes met, it felt like no time had passed at all. Vanessa, he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Hi, I said, my heart aching at the sight of him. We sat together for a while, catching up on everything we'd missed. He told me about his new job, his new apartment, his plans for the future. I told him about my new role at a smaller studio, how I was trying to rebuild my life. When it was time to leave, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. I'll always love you, he said quietly. I'll always love you too, I replied, tears welling in my eyes. And then he walked away, leaving me with the bittersweet knowledge that some loves aren't meant to last, no matter how deeply they're felt.